Okay, so if you're an employer in the UK, you know the rules around lead safety can feel, well, a bit complicated. So in the next few minutes, we're going to break down the official guidance into a simple, actionable plan. Basically, everything you need to know to protect your team and stay on the right side of the law. It's easy to think of lead poisoning as a problem from the history books, right? But the UK's Health and Safety Executive is crystal clear about this. It is a very real, very present danger in a lot of workplaces today. This isn't about the past, this is about keeping your people safe right now. And that really brings us to the main question, doesn't it? It's not enough to know lead is a hazard, you have to know what the law actually expects you to do about it. And that is exactly what we are going to lay out for you. So, where do you even begin? Well, the good news is the law doesn't expect you to be a scientist, but it absolutely demands that you start with one crucial step, a formal risk assessment. Seriously, everything else you do to manage lead safety flows directly from this single action. Suitable and sufficient. Those are the key words from the HSE. And let me tell you, this can't just be a quick box-ticking exercise. It's about really digging in and understanding where lead exists in your work, how your team could be exposed, and what those risks actually look like in the real world. You get this right, and you've built a solid foundation. Now, at first glance, this official HSE flowchart might look a little intimidating, but it's actually our roadmap for this whole process. It shows you the logical path you need to follow, from that very first assessment all the way to ongoing monitoring. Let's start with the first big decision it forces you to make. And here it is. This is the first major fork in the road on that map. Your risk assessment has one primary goal: to determine if the exposure to lead in your workplace is legally defined as significant. Your answer here is a big deal because it dictates exactly what you have to do next. So, what does significant actually mean in practice? Honestly, the best way to think of it is as a legal tripwire. If your team's exposure crosses this line, a whole new set of much stricter duties kicks in automatically. Things like mandatory air monitoring and medical checkups for your employees. And the regulations are super specific about this. Your exposure is considered significant if any one of these three things is true. First, if the amount of lead in the air goes over half the legal safety limit. Second, if there's a real risk someone could ingest it, hand-to-mouth contamination. And third, if there's a chance of skin contact with certain types of lead that can be absorbed directly. Okay, so once you understand the risk, you have a legal duty to act. But how? Well, the regulations give you a very clear framework for this. It's called the hierarchy of control. The big idea here is that you always have to try and fix the source of the problem, not just treat the symptom. It's exactly why you can't just hand out masks and call it a day. And if you remember one thing, make it this. Your number one legal and frankly moral obligation is to try and prevent exposure from happening at all. Before you even think about control measures, you have to ask, can we just get rid of lead in this process? Can we use something safer instead? Only when that is truly not an option do you move on to controlling the risk. This lays out that hierarchy perfectly. You always start at the top. Can you get rid of it or swap it out? If the answer is no, you move down to engineering controls, things like proper ventilation that physically contain the danger. Below that, you have organizational changes, like adjusting work schedules. And notice what's at the very bottom: personal protective equipment. PPE is absolutely crucial, but the law sees it as your last line of defense, not your first choice. Now, here's a critical number you've got to know. This is the occupational exposure limit, or OEL, for most common forms of lead. It's the maximum concentration allowed in the air over a typical 8-hour shift. This is the benchmark. This is the number your control measures have to beat to be considered adequate. But hey, putting those controls in place isn't the end of the story. If your initial assessment found that exposure is significant, you now have an ongoing duty to prove that your controls are actually working day in and day out. And that's where monitoring comes in. Let me be clear, this is non-negotiable. If you have significant exposure, it automatically triggers two key ongoing duties. First, you have to regularly test the air to prove you're staying below that legal limit. And second, you must enroll your affected employees in a medical surveillance program run by an approved doctor. This table shows us exactly how that medical surveillance works. It's all based on specific blood lead levels. Now notice there are two tiers here. An action level is basically an early warning alarm. If an employee's blood test hits this number, you have to immediately investigate your safety controls. A suspension level is a hard stop. At this point, that employee must be removed from any work involving lead until their levels drop. And it's really important to see the lower, more protective levels for women of reproductive capacity and younger workers. So we've definitely covered a lot of ground here, from that first assessment all the way to control and monitoring. Let's just pull it all together and do a quick recap of your core legal responsibilities as an employer. When you get right down to it, it really boils down to these 4 pillars. First, assess the risk. Second, prevent or control exposure, and always follow that hierarchy. Third, monitor the air and your team's health if the risk is significant. And finally, and this one is so important, inform and train your employees. Your safety systems are only as good as the people who have to use them every day. And that brings us to the end. I think the most important thing to take away is that a generally safe workplace isn't automatically a lead safe one. So the question I want to leave you with is this. Based on everything we've just covered, what's one process, one material, or one safety control that you can check tomorrow to start making sure your workplace is truly lead safe?